I can still picture the chipped formica on that desk, specifically the little crescent-shaped mark right in front of the phone. It was a pale yellow desk, the kind offices buy in bulk, and I spent nearly every weekday at it for almost 2 years. I was working as a data entry clerk then, a temporary position after college while I figured things out. It wasn't a bad job, just quiet, and I was always surprised to find little things left in the drawers when I cleaned them out. The chipped formica of my desk felt cold under my forearms. Just another Tuesday. Data entry. Endless columns of numbers that meant absolutely nothing to me. I was halfway through a batch of invoices when I found it, another one of those things tucked way back in the bottom drawer, almost under the metal crossbar. This time it was a key. Old-fashioned brass, with a little floral design on the head. Definitely not office-related. I held it up, turning it over in my fingers. It didn't look like any key I'd ever seen around here. Not for the file cabinets, not for the restrooms. It was apartment-sized, and a weird little prickle started at the back of my neck. I'd found a paperclip, a single earring, a dried-up pen in those drawers already. Lost and found overflow. I figured, people just tossed stuff. But this was different. This felt intentional. I glanced over at Tobias. He was still at it with the phone receiver. Polishing. Just polishing. It was mesmerizing and incredibly unsettling. He'd been doing it for nearly an hour, slowly rotating the receiver, meticulously wiping it with a tissue, then folding the tissue, then repeating. It wasn't even dirty. It was pale gray plastic, and it looked perfectly clean. I thought maybe he was stressed. New project deadline? Relationship trouble? I don't know him well enough to ask. It seemed rude to interrupt. I tried the key on the desk drawer lock, just out of curiosity. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't. I almost tossed it back in, but then I remembered Edna mentioning a lost key ring a few weeks ago. She'd been frantic, saying it had her apartment key on it. Maybe this was it. I made a mental note to ask her. It would be nice to do something helpful, and I wouldn't have to feel weird about it anymore. It was probably hers. It had to be. I kept the key in my wallet, tucked into that little card slot I never use. It felt wrong, carrying it around, like I was holding someone else's secret. I told myself it was just anxiety. I would ask Helen again, maybe she'd remember something more, but every time I was near her, the words caught in my throat. She wasn't evasive, just distant. She was always polishing her phone. The next day, I took the long way around the parking lot. I usually cut across the green space between the building and the loading dock, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a direct stare, more like a pressure at the back of my neck. I saw Yusuf leaving, heading towards his old Honda. He waved and I forced a smile. He didn't seem involved, just Yusuf. That afternoon, I noticed something off in my apartment. A book, a collection of poetry I hadn't touched since college, was on the kitchen counter. I always leave it on the bookshelf in the living room. I distinctly remember putting it there last week. I thought maybe I was just losing it, working too much, not sleeping enough. Stress. Then I noticed the thermostat. It was set to 78 degrees. I keep it at 72 degrees. I hadn't touched it. I checked all the windows. They were locked, and the curtains were drawn. Everything seemed normal, but the air felt thick, like someone had been breathing in my space. I started triple-checking the door lock every time I left, even though I knew I'd locked it. It was probably just me, being paranoid about the key. Someone probably just knows I live there. It's a small city. The chipped mug was on the floor again. Not broken, just on the floor. I put it on the drying rack last night. I'm sure of it. It's a small thing, but it felt like another one of those little nudges. Like someone was testing how much I'd notice. I called out, thinking maybe Tobias was here early, playing a joke, but there was no answer. I checked the lock again. Naturally, it was still locked. Then I noticed the blinds. They weren't fully down. I always pull them all the way down before bed. Always. I vaguely remembered adjusting them last night, but not like this. A sliver of the alley was visible, which meant someone could see in. It wasn't a huge deal, but it felt deliberate, like an invitation. My phone buzzed. It was Yael. Hey, quick question. Did you happen to see Edna yesterday? She was looking for something she dropped, a little velvet pouch, I think. Velvet pouch. That's what Vera had been holding when she lost her keys. A small, dark velvet pouch. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, just assumed it was for jewelry. But if Edna was looking for something dropped, and that key was found near my desk, maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was a mix-up, a series of unfortunate coincidences. Edna must have dropped the pouch, someone found the key with it, and it ended up near my desk. It felt almost logical. I went to reply to Yael, but the front door clicked open. Not a key turning, a click, like it was already unlocked. I froze. Willa stood in the doorway holding a grocery bag. "Oh, hey, I brought you some cookies. Thought you might need a pick-me-up." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I let myself in. "You never answer your door." My mouth felt dry. You have a key?" "Oh yeah, Helen gave it to me. She said you mentioned you sometimes work late and might lock yourself out. Thought it would be helpful." She walked further in, setting the bag on the counter. "Don't worry, I won't be a bother. Just dropping these off." She kept walking, deeper into my apartment, and I just stood there, watching her, the chipped mug still on the floor, the blinds slightly open, and the click of the door echoing in my head. She was still in the kitchen making tea, Helen, like she owned the place. I finally managed to say something, just a mumbled, "You didn't have to come in." She waved a hand, dismissive. "Nonsense, dear. Just wanted to be sure you were all right. You seemed a bit flustered when I texted." Flustered. I hadn't even realized I was flustered. I kept glancing at the counter, at the groceries she'd brought. Apples, some weird kind of herbal tea I'd never seen before, and a loaf of sourdough. Things I wouldn't buy. It felt curated, like someone was trying to anticipate my needs, or worse, create them. I called Tobias. He's a lawyer and does a lot of pro bono work for people in the building. I told him about the key, about Helen just walking in, about the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I didn't mention the stuff that had been happening before, the things I'd dismissed as stress or tiredness. I just focused on the key, on the violation of it. Tobias was calm. Too calm, maybe. He said Helen was a bit eccentric, a little overbearing, but ultimately harmless. He thought maybe she was just trying to be a good neighbor. He suggested I just ask her directly why she had the key, a direct confrontation. It sounded reasonable. I did, later that afternoon. Helen just smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. "Oh, that. Yael mentioned you were starting to take pottery classes and sometimes lose track of time. She thought it'd be a kindness." Yael. Another person I'd mentioned something to in passing weeks ago. It was starting to feel less random, less like coincidence. It felt planned, like they were building something around me, piece by piece, knowing exactly what I'd say to whom. Like I was a character in a play, and they already knew the script. It wasn't just the key, or Helen, or Yael. It was everything. Little things. I came home one evening and the rug in the living room was angled differently. Not dramatically, just off. I'm usually pretty meticulous about that rug. Then a book I hadn't touched in years was open on the kitchen table, marked with a pressed flower. A violet, I think. I don't even have violets. I spent a good hour trying to remember if I'd moved them, if I'd even read that book recently. Nothing. I started checking things. I double-checked locks and went over my mail. It wasn't about things being stolen. It was about things being adjusted, arranged, like someone was tidying up, but not in a helpful way, in a way that felt like they were staging something. I thought it was Lorne. He'd been asking a lot about my schedule casually over email. He's in IT and always offers to optimize my home network. I figured he'd found a way to access my smart devices, maybe a camera, maybe even something more. It felt ridiculous even thinking it, but it was the only thing that made sense. A tech guy subtly observing, making small changes. I changed all my passwords, of course, and I stopped replying to Lorne's emails. He sent a few follow-ups, concerned about my network security. Then they stopped. Now, I ask Vera everything. Everything. She's my building manager, and she always seemed invisible before. Just a face at the front desk. Now, I ask her about maintenance schedules, deliveries, any contractors working in the building. Every single detail. It's exhausting. It's made me late for things and canceled plans. But before I agree to anything, a coffee with a new acquaintance, a suggestion for a weekend trip, I run it by her. Just a quick, "Hey, has anyone mentioned?" It's probably pointless. But the other day, she glanced at me with a look I couldn't read and said, "You're being very thorough." And then she just kept filing papers. I sit with her a little longer now, every time I see her, just to watch her hands. I still remember the texture of the choir mat, rough, almost prickly under my fingertips as I lifted the corner. It was a simple thing to check for drafts, honestly, just a habit from growing up. I'd moved into the place a few weeks earlier, trying to put some distance between myself and, well, everything. It was a small cottage on the edge of town, perfect for one person starting over after a particularly messy split. That mat, and what was underneath it, keeps popping into my head when I think about that time. The unpacking was slow. Boxes were everywhere. Obviously, mostly books, I think. I kept expecting to find that box of old photos, the ones with Sergio, but it hadn't shown up yet, probably in the garage. I'd get to that tomorrow. It was late afternoon and I was trying to get the kitchen at least functional, just enough for a cup of tea. That's when I found it. Under the flower pot by the back door. A key. Not a house key exactly. More like a shed key, or maybe for an old toolbox. It was brass, tarnished, with a little plastic fob that had the number 317 on it. I didn't recognize it. I definitely hadn't put it there. I went through all the keys I had, the ones from the rental agency, my car key, even that ridiculous little padlock key from my old bike. Nothing matched. It was just there. I asked myself if maybe the previous tenants had lost one, left it for someone, but wouldn't they have told the landlord? Then I remembered Mrs. Opal, the neighbor. She'd been watching me when I arrived, not in a creepy way, not exactly, just intense. And she'd been meticulously straightening the rocks in her garden, one by one, for a solid 5 minutes while I was carrying boxes in. She hadn't said hello, just watched and rearranged rocks. Maybe she'd found the key. Maybe she was trying to return it. It felt silly to even think that, but it was the only thing that made sense. I decided I'd ask her tomorrow. I put the key on the kitchen counter, figuring I'd deal with it in the morning. I made my tea and tried to ignore the prickle on the back of my neck. It was probably just exhaustion. It had been a long drive, and I was still getting used to being alone. I didn't ask Opal about the key. I just didn't. It felt too soon, too strange. And honestly, she was out there weeding again, and I just didn't want to interrupt. It felt rude to bother someone so focused. I made coffee instead strong and started unpacking books, trying to make it feel normal. Around lunchtime, I decided to walk into town for groceries. It's not much of a town, really. A general store, a post office, a diner. As I was locking the back door, I noticed the kitchen window was open. Just a crack, but definitely open. I know I closed it. I always close it. It's old glass, drafty. I checked all the doors, all the windows, everything locked. Except that one window. I told myself it must have been the wind, even though it wasn't particularly windy. I shut it, double-checking the latch. In town, I ran into Bet, who runs the general store. She remembered my name, which surprised me. "Heard you moved in over at the old Harvey place," she said, her voice like gravel. "Sergio used to live there, you know, years ago. Nice young man." Sergio. That name, I hadn't heard it in almost 10 years. A flush crept up my neck. I just smiled and said I hadn't known. Bet went on talking about Sergio's prize-winning tomatoes, how he always helped with the church bake sale. It was odd, and then she asked if I was settling in all right, and mentioned, completely casually, "It's good to have someone keeping an eye on the place, you know? It's been empty for a while." I hurried through the store, bought only what I absolutely needed. On the walk back, I took the long way, adding a loop along the main road, just in case. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was adjusting to my movements. I checked the windows again before bed. Every single one. Old houses settle, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But the latch on the kitchen window hadn't been loose yesterday. I was sure of it. I tightened it, double-checked, and even wedged a small piece of wood under the frame. Felt foolish doing it, honestly, like I was playing house with a ghost. This morning, the wood was gone. The window still latched, but it was different, like it had been fiddled with. And then I found it. Tucked under the ceramic frog on the back porch, a key, not a house key, but a key, an old one, brass and heavy. It didn't fit the front door, the back door, or the shed. I tried every lock I could find. Nothing. Then I remembered the cellar. The cellar door was always sticky, always a pain. I'd meant to oil the lock, but hadn't gotten around to it. The key slid in, smooth as butter. The cellar smelled like damp earth and something else. Something faintly floral, like potpourri. Viv used to make potpourri. It was ridiculous. Viv and I hadn't spoken in a long time, but she'd always been obsessed with scents. I started to feel a little sick. Maybe she just sent me a weird thinking of you package? A key as some kind of joke? It was a terrible joke. I took a step down, then froze. A light was on, a small work lamp plugged into an extension cord that snaked along the stone floor, and there on the workbench were my gardening gloves, the ones I'd left by the back door, and a small, meticulously arranged pile of my favorite bulbs, tulips, the ones I'd ordered online last week. Someone had been down here recently, and they knew what I was planning to plant. The tulips, seeing them down there, arranged like that. It wasn't just unsettling, it felt mocking, like someone was deliberately showing off. I spent the rest of the day going over every lock, every window. I even called a locksmith and had him rekey everything. He was a young guy named Dex, and he seemed a little bored by the whole thing, keeping whistling. I told him about the key I'd found, hidden by the meter. He shrugged. Happens, he said. Ex-partners, disgruntled tenants, curious kids. It didn't feel like any of those things. I called Opal from the general store. I hadn't really talked to her about Sergio, not directly. Just small talk. But that day, I asked her about the previous owner. Old man Price, she said, without missing a beat. Lived here for 50 years, quiet fella, kept to himself, sold the place after his wife passed. Norma, lovely woman, always brought me cookies. She paused. Price was particular about the garden, roses mostly, said they needed constant attention. That's when it hit me. Maybe Price hadn't sold the place. Maybe he'd rented it out, and maybe he'd just forgotten to take everything with him. The gloves, the bulbs, a lonely old man clinging to his routines. It was ridiculous, but it felt easier than the other option. I asked Opal if Price still lived around. Oh no dear, she said. Moved down to Florida with his daughter Bet. Been gone nearly a year. I felt foolish explaining it all to Bet over the phone. I didn't mention the key, just the gardening supplies. She was surprisingly understanding, said her father was a bit of a hoarder, always leaving things behind. She offered to come up and sort through everything. I said no. I didn't want anyone else in the house. She sounded disappointed, and I felt a prickle of something I couldn't name. She knew the layout of the cellar, she said. She'd spent years helping her father down there. And then before we hung up, she asked, "He always did have a fondness for tulips, didn't he?" I kept thinking about Bet's question. The tulips. It wasn't just that Price liked them, it was how she phrased it. He always did, like she knew something I didn't. It wasn't a casual observation, it was a test. I started going through old photos, the ones from when I was with Dex. There, a picture from the garden, Price's garden, before I even bought the place. He'd given us a tour showing off his prize-winning bulbs, and Dex, grinning, holding a single red tulip. I hadn't thought about that in years. It suddenly felt less about Price and more about Dex. He'd been the one obsessed with the house, the one who'd first pointed it out, saying it had good bones. He'd been the one who'd pushed me to look past the damp and the overgrown yard. Had he talked to Price after we broke up, tried to buy it himself? It seemed so far-fetched, but it explained the key. Maybe Price hadn't wanted to sell to me. Maybe Dex had brokered some kind of arrangement. A quiet agreement to keep a back door open. I started checking everything, every window, every lock. I even called Sergio the locksmith again, just to rekey everything. He gave me that same look, the one that said I was overreacting, but I insisted I needed to. The other day, I found a small hand-painted stone in the garden, tucked under the rose bushes, a tiny ladybug. Dex used to collect those. He'd paint them and hide them for me to find. It was sweet, I guess, but it felt wrong, like a deliberate message. Now, before I agree to anything, a coffee date, a work meeting, even a phone call with someone I haven't spoken to in a while, I look them up. Not just a quick Google search, I dig. Old articles, social media, anything I can find. It's exhausting, and I've lost touch with people because of it. But I always check, always. It's just a habit now, a quiet, persistent hum beneath everything else, and I don't think it will ever stop. I've spent a long time trying to understand what happened, and honestly, I still don't. It wasn't a single event, more a slow unraveling, and I keep circling back to the beginning, searching for a reason. I called someone to help with small repairs, a perfectly normal thing to do, and that's where it started. Even now, months later, I have no clear explanation for what followed. The wallpaper was the next thing. I'd mentioned a couple of small tears, barely noticeable in the dining room. Fitch, the handyman, had been working on the window frames all morning, and I figured he'd get to it eventually. When I came back from making lunch, it wasn't patched. It was different. Not just the tears were gone. The whole section of wallpaper, about 4 feet square, had been removed and replaced. Same pattern, same faded floral, but it wasn't aged like the rest. It was brighter, you could tell. I asked him about it. He just blinked, slow, like he was trying to focus. Oh, that, yes, bit of damage. Got some leftover from when I did Mrs. Alma's house. Seemed a good fit. Mrs. Alma lived in another town. What would he have leftover wallpaper from her house? It didn't make sense, but it matched almost perfectly. I chalked it up to him being resourceful. A little odd to carry scraps around, but not malicious, just eccentric. Then I noticed the key. On the kitchen counter, right next to the fruit bowl, a spare. I definitely didn't leave it there. I only had one spare, and I kept it hidden in the little ceramic frog on the windowsill. I checked. The frog was empty. "Fitch?" I asked, my voice sounding higher than usual. "Did you see a key? A spare key?" He was fiddling with his toolbox, meticulously lining up the screwdrivers. "Key? Oh, yes. Found it under the mat by the back door. Thought you might want it handy." Under the mat? I never put a key under the mat. That's what people in movies do. It was a stupid place. Anyone could find it, but he'd found it. And now it was here, on my counter. He'd put it there after retrieving it, I thought. Showing kindness even, preventing a lockout. It was thoughtful in a strange way. I thanked him, a little shakily, and went to put it back in the frog, just to be sure. The frog was empty. Completely empty. I stared at it for 1 minute, maybe more. Just nothing. I checked everywhere. Every drawer, every shelf, even the junk closet. Nothing. It hadn't walked off, had it? A key doesn't just walk off. I felt this ridiculous urge to tear the kitchen apart. But then I remembered. Fitch, he'd had it. He'd put it on the counter after getting it from wherever. I drove to the hardware store the next day, hoping to catch him. I needed to ask. I needed to understand. He wasn't there. Old Man Alton was behind the counter and said Fitch had called in sick. It sounded flat, the way he said it, like he didn't believe it himself. I asked Alton if Fitch mentioned anything about a key, anything about my house. He just blinked at me, slow and deliberate. "Fitch does a lot of jobs, son. He can't keep track of them all." I started taking the long way home after that. Different streets, different turns. It felt stupid, paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I noticed things I hadn't before. A dark blue sedan parked a few houses down, always a woman walking her dog at the same time every evening. Nothing concrete, just details. I told myself it was the stress. Then, on Tuesday, I found the mail rearranged. Not stolen, not tampered with, just sorted differently than I always do it. Bills grouped with catalogs, magazines stacked separate. It was minor, barely noticeable, but I know how I sort my mail. And then I remembered I'd stopped at Mona's bakery that morning. I always take that side street. It's quicker. But that side street is also where the blue sedan had been parked the last 3 nights. It wasn't watching my house, it was watching me. I think someone is trying to tell me something. Maybe Fitch is involved with insurance fraud or something. It's the only thing that makes sense. I kept seeing the man. Not constantly, but enough. Always walking. Always the same stretch of road near the hardware store. Dark jacket, head down. He never looked at me directly. Just in my peripheral vision. I started taking different routes, trying to avoid him. It felt ridiculous, like a bad movie. I even asked Alma at the bakery if she'd noticed anyone unusual hanging around. She said nothing, just gave me that tight little smile she does when she thinks I'm being silly. On Wednesday, I found a small stone on the porch. Just a normal river stone, smooth and gray. But I don't have stones on my porch. I swept it up, thinking maybe a kid had thrown it. Then I remembered Fitch had been working near the porch steps on Tuesday afternoon. Maybe he dislodged it with his tools? It felt reaching. But what else? I called the police non-emergency line, reported the rearranged mail and the stone. They were polite, said they'd patrol the area more often. It felt like nothing. Then, this morning, I woke up to the sound of someone trying the back door, not breaking in, just the handle turning. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the bed and went downstairs. The door was locked, thankfully, no sign of forced entry, but the patio furniture had been shifted. Just a few inches, enough to notice, and a blue sedan was across the street, parked, not the driver, just the car. I didn't call the police this time. I just got in my car and drove. Drove until I reached Vince's place. Vince used to be a security consultant. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I told him. He kept asking if I'd changed the locks recently, like that was the answer. He said it sounded like someone was testing my routine, casing the place. It's not random. They're planning something. Vince just didn't get it. He kept circling back to the spare key I'd found hidden under the fake rock by the back steps. Anyone could have a key made, he said, like that was profound. He even suggested I'd misplaced it myself, which felt like a deliberate dismissal. I told him about the car, the silver sedan I kept seeing, always parked 1 block over. He said it was probably just someone who lived nearby. I wanted to shake him. I wanted him to see how different this was. I ended up calling Ada. Ada is a lawyer and did some pro bono work for a tenants' rights group years ago. We weren't close, but she'd always been thorough. I told her everything. The key, the car, the feeling of being watched, even the small things like the mail being moved. I thought maybe someone was trying to establish a claim on the property, some kind of squatter's rights thing. Ada listened and asked a lot of questions. She did some digging, she said. She checked property records and talked to a few people. What she found wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a property dispute. It was Vince. Apparently, he'd been quietly buying up properties in the neighborhood, not directly, through shell companies. And he'd been asking around about me, specifically about my work. He'd mentioned to a neighbor that I was a bit of a recluse, said it with a strange emphasis. It didn't make sense. Why would he do that? Was he trying to push down property values, force people out? I kept replaying our conversation, trying to find some clue, some indication. He hadn't asked about my work. Not really. He'd asked what I did with my time. It was subtle, but he was assessing me. Not the house, me, and the spare key. He'd steered the whole conversation toward it. He wanted me to focus on that. It's been years. I still check the locks. Not obsessively, not like I did right after, but every single time. It feels stupid admitting that, especially since nothing obvious ever happened again. After the lawyer, after talking to the police, it just stopped. The little things stopped. The misplaced books, the feeling of being watched, the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the evenings. They were gone. I moved some furniture around a few weeks ago, finally getting around to rearranging the living room, and I found it, tucked under the sofa, almost completely hidden by the skirt. Another key. Not a spare this time, not to the house. It was a small brass key, the kind you'd use for a filing cabinet or a lockbox. It didn't look new, it looked used. I really thought it meant Vince had been more thorough than I realized. that he'd been hiding something in the house, something he'd been accessing all along. I spent days searching, checking every drawer, every cabinet, even taking apart some of the old furniture. Nothing. Then I remembered Alma mentioning the community center. She'd said Vince was on the board, handled some of their finances. Maybe it was a key to that. Maybe he was embezzling, using the house as a drop point for something. It felt contained then, a local scandal, something I could understand. I still avoid that bakery. Not because of Mona, not exactly. It's just the way she looked at me, knowing or pretending to. It wasn't malice, it was assessment, like I was a problem that needed solving. I saw a man yesterday, outside the hardware store. He looked a lot like Fitch, but taller and older. He was watching me, not staring, just aware. And I did what I always do now. I walked the long way around the block. I always walk the long way around. I wonder if he even noticed. I wonder if anyone ever does.